I knew the air had turned rotten the second HR offered me a bottle of water before telling me why I was summoned. That only happens when they are about to ruin your life politely. The kind of polite that comes with laminated talking points and a second HR rep sitting in the corner scribbling like a courtroom sketch artist. Susan, they started, like they were easing me into hospice care, you've been instrumental to grant them metrics. 11 years of dedication, and we can't thank you enough. Cue the funeral music. Then came the part where they said the word strategic realignment like it was a flavor of yogurt instead of a gut punch. My title, Operations Lead, was being phased out in favor of a more agile approach to cross-functional synergy. In English, they were handing my entire role over to Brad. Brad, the CEO's semi-employed nephew with a YouTube channel about manifesting wealth and exactly zero understanding of vendor compliance, regulatory audit trails, or adult behavior in general. Brad, the guy who once forwarded one of my process flowcharts back to me with the note, make this more vibe-aligned. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. I just nodded and took the bottle of water like a condemned woman politely accepting her last cigarette. Hey, before we go further, quick thing. If you're listening to this and thinking, damn, this kind of quiet, cold-brewed corporate betrayal hits home, maybe tap that subscribe button. It helps more than you think. And hit like too, because it really does keep this little revenge-fueled engine running, and our whole team lives off petty justice and algorithm crumbs. Anyway, back to my funeral. The kicker came when my boss, Chuck, walked in mid-meeting wearing his I've got good news smile, the one he usually saves for bake sales and vendor rebates. He clapped a hand on my shoulder and said, we're promoting family. Promoting family, like it was some sacred rite, like we were all standing in a Norman Rockwell painting instead of a spreadsheet hellscape built on my blood, caffeine, and 3 a.m. contract revisions. Brad wasn't just being given my role. He was being handed the keys to every process I'd spent over a decade refining, streamlining, and crisis-proofing. Procurement pipelines, risk audits, master services agreements, stuff that didn't just matter, it protected the company from lawsuits, fines, and flaming dumpsters of liability. And Brad once got locked in the server room because he thought it was the wellness nap pod, so I nodded again. And I said, congratulations, Brad. He blinked, surprised, like he expected me to break down or make a scene. But I wasn't going to give any of them that satisfaction. No tears, no raised voice, just silence, the kind that grows sharp edges when you leave it long enough. They moved me to an advisory role. No team, no projects, just a badge, a laptop, and an email that now auto-forwarded most things to Brad for approval. My calendar went from meetings and vendor calls to white space. No one needed me. No one wanted me in the room. But you know what no one disabled? My access. Still had read-only rights to the shared drive. Still had permissions to the contract archives. Still had my signature on the MSA addendum, the one I'd pushed through 2 years ago when legal was out with the flu and we needed emergency continuity protocols. Clause 14.3b. It sat there, dusty and ignored, under a PDF labeled Final, Real Final MSAV 7, and right there in black and white. Any reassignment of operational authority without formal delegation documentation shall render said contract void in the event of control transfer. No one had revoked it. No one had overridden my authority at the time. They'd promoted family. But they hadn't buried me properly, so I waited. I logged off Slack, muted the company town halls, smiled at Brad's weekly vision update emails full of emojis and empty jargon, let him fumble forward into the spotlight, and I sharpened my silence into a knife. Brad had the gall to say, let's loop Susan in for optics, like I was a potted plant he needed for ambience. That's how I ended up on a Zoom call I was never meant to speak on, camera off, mic muted, just a ghost hovering at the edge of my own legacy, while he steamrolled every inch of it into a corporate slideshow. The meeting was with our biggest client, one whose contract, the Master Services Agreement, I had personally written, revised, and negotiated over 6 months of migraine-inducing legal back and forth. This wasn't just any document. It was the document, the backbone of our entire operation. The thing that made investors take Grantham metrics seriously. The thing that kept us from getting sued every time Brad had a new idea involving crypto, gamification, or God help me, scalable soul alignment. Now here he was, clicking through a color-coded slide deck like a toddler showing off macaroni art. He mispronounced indemnification, skipped 3 sections entirely, and referred to a clause about service-level expectations as probably optional, right? My personal favorite. When he tried to explain the failover protocol and said, in the event of like a server explosion or alien invasion or whatever, we pivot to another server, he chuckled. The client didn't. I should have been furious, should have stood up, turned my mic on, and gutted him with facts. But I didn't, I just took notes, quietly, patiently. Every wrong term, every skipped section, every pause where he looked to his assistant like a child searching for the bathroom. And then came lunch. He waltzed into the break room like he'd just returned from war, holding a salad the color of despair and talking into his AirPods. When he saw me, he lit up like a discount LED bulb and said, hey, Susan, You catch that call? Pretty good flow, huh? I looked up from my microwaved lentils and said, interesting interpretation. He laughed. We're simplifying everything. Gotta declutter all that legacy crap you built. Legacy crap. He meant the contract language that kept us out of court last year. The emergency redundancy systems that saved us during the December outage. The compliance checklist that took us from backwater vendor to enterprise ready overnight. Crap, apparently. Brad then dropped into the seat across from me like we were old war buddies. He bit into his salad and started rambling about making the onboarding docs feel more TikTok and less IRS. I chewed, nodded, smiled, and started my catalog, not just notes, evidence. I downloaded the call recording from the Zoom archive, backed up the internal chat logs, copied the Slack thread where his assistant asked me, off the record, what clause 14.3b was and whether she should delete it from the next version. I replied, check the audit log before making changes. Always. She reacted with a heart emoji. That same afternoon, Brad forwarded me a marked-up draft of the MSA with half the protections gutted and a new section called Strategic Vibes and Operational Mood Boards. I printed it, annotated every change in red, then filed it under just in case. No one asked me what I thought, not Chuck, not legal, not the board. I had become background noise in a system I built. But here's the thing about background noise, it hums, it builds. It drowns out the idiots when the power flickers, so I kept humming. Logged every time Brad used my language and claimed it as his. Tracked each revision to client contracts, noted when he skipped required signatures, watched him talk over junior staff, rewrite SOPs without compliance sign-off, and wave off vendor warnings like they were spam emails. Each time I smiled. He thought silence meant defeat, but silence is just what happens before the avalanche. My badge still worked, technically. I could get through the front doors, wave politely at reception, even sit in the same beige ergonomic chair I'd inhabited for over a decade, but everything else had been stripped like bark off a tree. My calendar was blank. My inbox was quiet. My name was gone from project threads. No more client calls. No more vendor escalations. No more late-night legal reviews where I fell asleep face down on a non-disclosure clause. I was now in a non-critical advisory role, which, translated from HR speak, meant I was a ghost with a salary. I even had the gall to send a company-wide announcement. Excited to share, Susan will now serve in an elevated strategic capacity as our senior advisor emeritus on operations evolution. A title so puffed up and hollow it might as well have come with a paper crown and a gift card to Olive Garden. No one asked me anything, not even questions they used to panic over. Where's the vendor clause for third-party data retention? What does clause 9.2 mean under ISO review? What counts as breach during a merger? Silence. It was insulting, yes, but worse, it was intentional. They wanted me to fade out quietly like background static, like a loyal dog sent out to pasture with a pat on the head and a handful of old bones. But I wasn't going anywhere. I still had access. Not to emails or contracts in play, Brad had seen to that, but the shared drive, they forgot that part. Every folder I built, every audit log, every finalized PDF with locked signatures and embedded timestamps, every change tracked, every version labeled not just final, but final use this one. And tucked into the corner of one unassuming folder, named in lowercase like it didn't matter, was the original Master Services Agreement, the real one. The framework that kept Grantham from collapsing under its own incompetence. At the very bottom, pended with a quiet little addendum D, was a clause I'd written in the early COVID days when legal was juggling remote notarizations and CFOs were panicking about insurance coverage. It was buried beneath force majeure revisions and continuity planning, back when everyone was too sleep-deprived to notice what passed across their desks. Clause 14.3b. In the event of leadership reallocation affecting key operational authorities, the MSA remains enforceable only upon formal delegation of duty to a named replacement, signed by the prior authority and witnessed by compliance or legal. It was CYA boilerplate, corporate folklore. Everyone ignored it, everyone but me, because Brad had never asked me to sign a delegation. Chuck hadn't routed anything through legal. They'd ripped me out of the role like weeds from the garden and assumed silence meant consent. So I opened the change log. My name, my digital signature, time-stamped, locked, no one had touched it. Clause 14.3b was still live, and in the context of a control transfer like, say, an acquisition, it was a kill switch. I sat back in my chair, the one I was no longer authorized to adjust the lumbar settings on, and exhaled like I was coming up from underwater. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't pound. This wasn't revenge. It was record-keeping. Brad wanted advisory? Fine. Here's my advice. Never remove the woman who remembers where all the bodies are buried, especially if she drew the original damn map. I spent the next hour printing copies. Addendum D, Clause 14.3b, the original MSA, my signature history, the email chain where legal acknowledged receipt, the silence that followed. I labeled the folder just in case and saved it 3 ways: cloud, encrypted, flash, and paper hard copy in a manila envelope tucked inside the freezer behind my emergency vodka. I didn't know exactly when I'd need it, but I knew why. Because somewhere in a slick boardroom with fresh pressed khakis and buzzword bingo cards, some investor was going to ask for operational continuity. And when they did, the house of cards Brad built on PowerPoint slides and vibes was going to come crashing down. Not because I raised my voice, but because I never revoked my signature. By the time due diligence officially kicked off, Brad had settled comfortably into the role of corporate golden retriever: big energy, no discipline, and a complete inability to stay focused unless someone waved a buzzword in front of him like a chew toy. We're entering an era of expansive synergy, he declared at the kickoff call with the investor group, as though he'd just discovered how Google Calendar works. Our client framework is lean, clean, and fully optimized for strategic reorientation. Translation: he didn't understand a goddamn thing he was saying, but the slides looked pretty and he got to say the word pivot 6 times in a row without someone slapping him with a stapler. Chuck, our benevolent dictator of a CEO, sat beside him in full proud dad mode, nodding like Brad had just announced he'd invented spreadsheets. I watched from a seat in the back corner of the conference room, invited just in case, but really brought in for the same reason people keep fire extinguishers around, only to be broken out when everything's already burning. Brad walked the investor team through an overview of Grantham metrics, fumbling through legal frameworks like they were IKEA instructions written in Sanskrit. At one point, he claimed our vendor failover time was under 30 seconds. It's actually 4 minutes. I should know, I built the protocol. The lead investor squinted at the slide. That's aggressive, he said politely. Brad replied, we're disruptors, disruptors. Jesus wept. Every time he got something wrong, I made a note, not dramatic, just a bullet point and a timestamp. Every misstatement, every contradiction. Every time he flipped through a slide like he was guessing what was on it for the first time. When they asked how we ensured contract integrity over multiple version revisions, he said, we clean house every quarter, keep it fresh. Fresh. That's how you describe produce, not binding agreements with indemnity clauses. The room got quieter when someone from the investor's legal team chimed in. We'll need copies of all MSA versions from the last 3 years. Full audit trail, including change logs. Brad's smile tightened. He clicked around, pulling up a folder from his desktop labeled MSA Archives for DD. A handful of PDFs, mostly outdated, one misspelled Master Service Agam v2, no addenda, no signed authority transitions, no clause 14.3b. He emailed them the folder without even opening the files. I leaned back in my chair and crossed one leg over the other, said nothing. The legal rep gave a tight little smile. We'll confirm receipt. Expect some follow-ups. Brad gave a thumbs up, a literal thumbs up, on a call with multi-million-dollar investors. I excused myself before I laughed out loud. Back at my desk, still mine, though stripped of purpose like a trophy with no nameplate, I logged into the drive and downloaded another full version archive. The real one. The one that included the final MSAs, addenda, change logs, audit trails, approval workflows. And of course, clause 14.3b, tucked away like a landmine waiting for the wrong step. I labeled it for reference only and tucked it into my private archive. Time-stamped, version-controlled, untouched by Brad's greasy, emoji-riddled incompetence. They had made the mistake of thinking access was power, but power wasn't in the room, it was in the paper trail. Each time Brad misstepped, I marked it down like a conductor following a crescendo. This wasn't a meltdown yet, but it was the overture. And when the investors circled back with questions, oh, I knew exactly where the cracks would appear. He could strategize all he wanted, but you can't outpitch a missing clause. You can't smile your way past a contract that eats your acquisition alive from the inside. All I had to do was let the boy talk, and talk he did. The funny thing about accidents is that they tend to happen when people are in over their heads and flailing for air. Brad's assistant, bless her exhausted soul, had clearly reached the point where correcting his blunders was like trying to mop a hurricane with a Swiffer. I almost felt bad for her when she sent the email that cracked the facade wide open. Subject line, full contract archive per DD request attached, every version of the MSA going back 5 years, including mine, including the addenda, including Addendum D. The full audit trail, folder and all, zipped and timestamped from the compliance archive Brad didn't even know existed. She meant to send the scrubbed versions. Instead, she sent the truth. It took less than 36 hours for the email thread to land in the hands of a junior associate at the buyer's law firm, a woman probably 2 years out of law school, hungry, detail-obsessed, and still caffeinated enough to read all 87 pages of contractual language without skimming. Her name was Mia, and Mia did what Brad never had the competence or curiosity to do. She read the fine print. She flagged it on page 72. Clause 14.3, B. In the event of a leadership reallocation impacting key operational authorities, The Master Services Agreement remains valid only upon documented and signed delegation of said authority to a named successor, approved by legal or compliance. She sent an internal note to her supervisor. Was this clause ever nullified? The next day, an email went out from the buyer's general counsel. To Brad CC, Chuck Investor Counsel, Legal Review Team Subject. Clarification request MSA Clause 14.3b. Brad replied first within 6 minutes. Hey there, that clause is legacy, totally obsolete. We phased it out when we upgraded the framework last year. Not relevant to current filings. LMK, if you need anything else, thumbs up. I nearly spit out my tea. Obsolete? The man couldn't obsolete a lunch order. There was no record, no signature, no legal routing, no delegation paperwork. He never even read the clause. He just assumed that because he'd bulldozed over me with pastel slide decks and phrases like synergy and fusion, my authority had expired with my dignity. But contracts don't care about vibes. Contracts care about signatures. Later that afternoon, the buyer's legal team sent a reply. Direct. No exclamation marks, no emojis. To Susan Hastings CC. Grant them legal subject. Formal clarification request MSA Clause 14.3b. They knew. They knew Brad was bluffing. And now they were asking the one person in the company with the historical, legal, and operational knowledge to confirm whether the contract currently being used to justify a multi-million-dollar acquisition was in fact enforceable. Me. I didn't rush, didn't gloat. Just pulled the folder from my archive, opened the email I'd sent legal back in 2020 with the attached clause and approval note, checked the read receipt, and verified the timestamp. Then I drafted a calm, surgically clean reply. Clause 14.3b was implemented as part of Addendum D in March 2020. It has not been superseded or nullified. No formal delegation of authority was executed or filed. Therefore, any reassignment of operational authority without such documentation constitutes a breach of contract per the clause's conditions. I attached the PDF, embedded the email thread, cited the version history, refrained from adding. Tell Brad to eat shit, though the urge was biblical. 5 minutes after I hit send, I received a reply from the Investors Council. Thank you, Ms. Hastings. This is extremely helpful. We will pause active processing until this is resolved. No one at Grantham responded, not for the rest of the day. Slack went quiet. My inbox stayed dark. You could practically hear the blood draining from Chuck's face in real time. Brad didn't come by my desk. Of course he didn't, because now he knew. He wasn't just out of his depth. He was out of his league. And the person he thought he replaced had just become the sole reason his dream acquisition might die in utero. Version control matters, Brad, and mine has teeth. I hadn't heard my name spoken with respect inside Grantham Metrics for months. Not since the day they shoved me out with a latte and a laminated HR memo about growth through generational vision. But when the email from Investor Council hit my inbox that morning, I saw the subject line and knew the tide had shifted. Subject: Request for Clarification Meeting Clause 14.3b. The body of the email was clinical, courteous, and impossible to misread. Our legal team would appreciate a direct discussion regarding the origin and current applicability of Clause 14.3b, as referenced in the MSA archive. Your expertise and historical insight would be invaluable to our understanding. No copy to Brad, no copy to Chuck, just me and the lawyers. Funny how suddenly I was invaluable. I replied within the hour, happy to clarify, I'm available tomorrow. One request, I'd like to bring my notes for reference. Off the record, of course. Their response was immediate, absolutely. Please consider this meeting informal and confidential. I printed everything again, not because I didn't trust digital records, but because there's something about watching people squirm while you slide a manila folder across the table that just hits different. Inside were my originals. Emails, contracts, timestamps, version logs, every paper cut of truth I'd filed away while Brad was busy redesigning org charts with emojis and synergy pathways. The meeting was held in a side room on the 15th floor, away from the main Grantham offices. Neutral ground, quiet, private. There were 3 of them: the buyer's lead counsel, a contracts analyst who looked like he hadn't blinked in a decade, and Mia, the junior associate who'd spotted the clause. She gave me a nod, half conspiratorial, like we were on the same side of a secret war. We were. They offered water. I declined. Lead counsel started. Miss Hastings, thank you for coming. Want to confirm that Clause 14.3b was implemented in 2020, correct? I nodded, opening my folder. March 17th, to be exact. Added during pandemic restructuring to ensure continuity in leadership roles. We were building redundancy for worst-case scenarios: death, illness, abrupt exits. He raised an eyebrow. And you submitted this to Grantham Legal? I flipped to the printed email. Sent March 17, 11:24 a.m. Received by legal at 11:26. Read receipt confirmed. No objections filed. No superseding clause submitted. No delegation paperwork filed after my reassignment. So yes, 14.3b remains in full effect. The contracts analyst leaned in. And you were the named operational authority at the time? I pulled out a copy of the formal appointment letter. from Chuck himself. Signed, dated, and never officially rescinded or redelegated, which per the clause is required for the MSA to remain valid in a change of control scenario. Mia glanced at the page, eyes scanning fast. And this email chain, no follow-up from legal or the executive team? None, total silence. Probably assumed it was just another attachment, but silence isn't removal. Silence is consent when the paper trails this clear. The lead counsel sat back, slowly exhaling through his nose. Thank you, Miss Hastings. This is illuminating. That's lawyer speak for Brad is toast. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just closed the folder neatly and set my hands in my lap. He continued, our position is now materially affected by this clause. We'll be reevaluating certain timelines and expectations. We may reach out again for formal deposition depending on next steps. I understand, I said. There was a beat of silence. The analyst was already typing. Mia offered a soft smile. Lead counsel said, you've been very helpful. I nodded again. Just doing my job, even if no one remembers I still have one. As I stood to leave, I caught Mia's eye. She mouthed, nice work. Out in the hallway, the quiet was heavier than before, not tense, not uncertain, just charged. Back at my desk, still technically mine, even if stripped bare, I sat down and opened my email. Nothing from Chuck, nothing from Brad. But I knew the ripples were already spreading. They tried to erase me from the room. Now I was the only person keeping the deal alive or killing it. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits in a folder, signed and time-stamped, waiting for the right eyes to see it. They brought in pastries like it was a party. A glossy spread of fruit tarts and artisan croissants lined the back table of the conference room, as if carbs might soften what was about to happen. Brad strutted around in a tailored blazer too tight in the shoulders, shaking hands like a politician and flashing his can't-fail smile. Chuck was already seated at the head of the table, tie slightly askew, face flushed in that way it gets when he's either excited or terrified but doesn't know which yet. The investors arrived as a unit, calm, cold, professional. No small talk this time. No icebreakers. Just nods, laptops, and 3 identical black binders placed on the table with precision, like weapons being unholstered. I was seated near the edge, next to an unused power outlet, forgotten but present. Technically not invited, but still there. The buyer's lawyer, a man built like a mannequin and dressed like a scalpel, opened his binder without looking at anyone. He flipped silently to a tab marked in red. No rush, no performance. Then he read, voice flat as a flat line. Clause 14.3b. In the event of a leadership reallocation impacting key operational authorities, the Master Services Agreement remains valid only upon documented and signed delegation of said authority to a named successor, approved by legal or compliance. He looked up. There was silence. Long, heavy, a kind of corporate suffocation. You could hear the HVAC hum and the brittle edge of someone's fingernail tapping the table. The lawyer continued. There's no record of such delegation. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't accuse anyone. He simply closed the binder with a soft thud like the end of a sermon. Then, without ceremony, he slid it across the table back toward the CEO. Didn't say another word. Brad went pale, not white, not pink, just gray, like his soul had short-circuited. His mouth opened slightly, no words coming out, just breathe and panic. Chuck leaned toward our in-house legal counsel, voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut glass. Can we override that? The GC didn't move. His lips parted just enough to mutter, not without her. 3 words, the room shifted. The air went hot, then cold. Brad sank into his chair like he'd suddenly remembered gravity existed. One of the board members, Janice, who'd once told me I was too thorough to scale, was now blinking hard at the binder like it might disappear if she stared long enough. The lawyer from the buyer's team finally spoke. Calm, clear. Per the clause, the agreement becomes unenforceable upon unauthorized reassignment. We need a valid delegation from the original operational authority to proceed. No one spoke. No one dared because they all knew exactly what I knew. Brad never got that delegation. Chuck never requested it. Legal never followed up. They had plowed forward, drunk on their own certainty, convinced that replacing experience with bloodlines and charisma would be enough to carry a multi-million-dollar acquisition across the finish line. But I was still legally standing at the gate. I caught Brad's eye. He looked at me like I was a ghost who'd come back wrong. The lawyer closed his laptop. We'll pause here. That's how it ended. Not with a bang, but with the sound of a binder sliding slowly across a table and the weight of everyone finally realizing what silence can cost. Chuck's office door was closed, but it didn't matter. Everyone on the floor could hear him yelling. His voice shot through the walls like a bat in a grocery store, loud, panicked, and bouncing off every hard surface. Who authorized this? Silence. Where's the paperwork? More silence. How the hell does she still have signatory rights? HR was in full cardiac tap dance mode. I passed their office on my way to the elevator and caught a glimpse of Denise, our head of people ops, elbow deep in filing cabinets she hadn't touched in 5 years. Another junior staffer had 3 monitors up with internal systems open, toggling between employee records and contract management software like her job depended on it, which, to be fair, it probably did now. But they weren't going to find it because it didn't exist. There was no delegation, no signed handoff, no internal memo, no PDF labeled Susan transition Brad takeover final use it this own. Nothing, because nobody bothered. They assumed a smile, a handshake, and a boardroom PowerPoint with stock photos of diverse high fives were enough to rewrite legal continuity. The investor team had officially hit pause. Not canceled, paused. Which, in corporate acquisition language, is code for we're circling with our knives out and patience gone. The buyer's legal team submitted a formal request. Full review of all material contract changes, signatory delegations, and internal handoffs from the past 12 months. Every clause, every addendum, every single scrap of digital dust. And that's when the letter arrived. Hand-delivered, printed on company letterhead, embossed seal, the whole ceremonial dress-up. I opened it slowly, standing in the same break room where I'd once taught Brad the difference between a fixed vendor retainer and a contingency clause. He didn't remember. I did. Request for cooperation in external legal review. Dear Miss Hastings, in light of recent findings related to the Master Services Agreement and related governance materials, we respectfully request your cooperation in providing historical context, documentation, and clarification regarding your prior role as operational authority. Your knowledge and records have been deemed critical to resolving current legal queries by our investors. I folded the letter once carefully and slid it into my desk drawer next to a half-used pack of gum and a flash drive labeled Karma. A few minutes later, I received the follow-up email confirming the meeting time. Also attached, an agenda drafted by legal, requesting insights into my contract archive and clause interpretations, specifically Clause 14.3b. It was almost sweet, like watching a toddler try to fix a shattered vase with scotch tape and optimism. That afternoon, Chuck cornered me in the hallway, not yelling now, oh no. His voice had found a whole new octave, lower, tighter. Corporate contrition served lukewarm and shaking. Susan, clearly there's been a misunderstanding. Some things slipped through. You understand how fast-paced everything's been. I tilted my head. I understand you didn't remove me from my role correctly, I said, calm as a cloud. I was still the authorized signatory the day you promoted family. He blinked, twice. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice. Just let the truth hang there like a chandelier about to drop. Behind him, HR was still scuttling around with clipboards and sad eyes. Brad hadn't been seen since the binder slide. Rumor was he'd locked himself in a conference room and was watching leadership TikToks on mute. I went back to my desk, sat down, sipped my coffee, and waited, not for revenge, not even for validation. Just for the simple, quiet sound of a system cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. Turns out they didn't need me for strategy, but they needed me to close the deal. And I had all the time in the world. No pastries this time. No fake smiles, no icebreakers, no curated playlists humming softly in the background. The conference room was stripped down to its bones, just a table, some water bottles, and a silence thick enough to chew. Brad was already seated, trying to look composed, but his foot was bouncing under the table like a jackhammer on a sugar high. Chuck stood near the whiteboard, arms crossed, eyes bloodshot, tie loose like a man halfway through a heart attack, but too proud to ask for help. The board members had that distant, glassy-eyed stare rich people get when they realize their money might be walking out the door in someone else's briefcase. And then, without announcement, the investor's lawyer entered. He didn't shake hands, didn't sit, didn't say good morning. Just opened the same black binder he'd slid across the table days earlier, flipped to the familiar red tab and pointed. Clause 14.3b, he said, voice as dry as paper. This invalidates the contract under current terms. Brad's mouth dropped open. He looked toward Chuck like a kid caught cheating and waiting for his dad to lie for him. But Chuck said nothing. No more defense left, no more bluffing, just quiet dread. The lawyer continued, addressing the entire board now. Unless your original operational authority formally amends or delegates her signature authority, this agreement is unenforceable, which means we are suspending acquisition. He snapped the binder shut. Loud, final, silence followed. A thick, dreadful pause where everyone looked at everyone else but no one dared speak. Then came the whisper, faint, desperate, from one of the board members. Where is she? It wasn't a question. It was a plea. A minute later, someone from HR popped their head into my office like a groundhog sensing a storm. Susan, they'd like you in the boardroom. Of course they would. I stood, brushed the crumbs from my sleeve, and walked the long, carpeted hallway that used to belong to me. My footsteps were the only sound. No applause, no welcoming committee, just guilt hanging in the air like stale cologne. When I entered, Brad looked at me like I was death itself, wrapped in a blazer and holding a grudge. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I walked to the table, picked up the binder, and flipped to clause 14.3b myself, ran my finger slowly across the text. Let them watch me read the same line that had detonated their entire delusion. Then I closed the binder. You wanted family, I said, steady, calm, unbothered. So go ask your nephew, and I walked out. No door slam, no mic drop, just a quiet exit that felt like thunder in their bones. I didn't look back. The next morning, I was at home in my kitchen, robe on, coffee steaming in my favorite chipped mug that said world's okayest leader. Outside, the leaves were changing, gold, rust, fire. My phone buzzed. A text from Mia, the junior associate. You were brilliant, just thought you should know. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Courier in a windbreaker, cardboard envelope in hand. Inside, a letterhead from the investor group. A private consulting offer, terms generous. Rate absurd, more than double Brad's salary. I took a sip of coffee, sat back in my chair, watched the steam rise. Silence, it turns out, is expensive, and I had let them pay full price. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.